This is Kumiko Makihara, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Anderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kumiko Makihara.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are handy links over in the sidebar on the right-hand side where you can subscribe to the show. You can find all of the archives in a handy little drop-down list, or there's a search bar where you can search for your favorite author and see if they have been on the show in these past more than 400 episodes. Thank you to our sponsors for allowing us to do this. And we've got some new sponsors coming on. Daniel Kinney, my favorite middle grade author, is just doing amazing things right now. He is publishing like a madman, but he's putting out excellent books. I buy his books for my nieces and nephews all the time. My kids are a little older now, but my nieces and nephews, I buy Daniel's books and put them in their hands. They are top shelf quality and really fun books. There's a link to Daniel's Amazon page in the show notes, and we're going to be highlighting more of his books as we go on this month. But go visit Daniel Kinney and buy his books for your favorite kids, and they will love it. Roy M. Griffiths has a new book, Bringing the Fire, The Lonesome George Chronicles, Book 2. Roy is really doing some amazing stuff in speculative fiction, and we're going to be highlighting more of those as the month goes on. But go pick up Roy's newest books. There's a link to it in the show notes. If you're a fan of alternative history or war and military thrillers, you're going to love these books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, thanks to my buddies Nick and Jason from Galaxy's Edge for sponsoring the show. I would like to welcome back as a sponsor to the show, Nick Breaker and his fantastic series, Essence. Book 1, Septima, and Book 2, Alta, are out now. Nick is feverishly working to release Book 3 now. It's in editing, and you are going to absolutely love this series. Troy, with his irrational fears, is the least likely person to lead a war, but that doesn't mean he can escape his destiny. This fantastic science fiction action series is full of great characters, great character development, lots of action, and lots of weird science fiction goodness. If you love a great character-driven story with great science fiction, you are going to love this series. Essence. 2 books are out now. Book 1, Essence. Book 2, Alta. And the 3rd book will be here soon. Get into this series now. Everyone's talking about it. Thank you, Nick Breaker. Thanks for tuning in. As always, at the end of the show, we have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Kumiko Makihara on the show with me. She has a brand new book out. It just came out a couple of days ago when you're hearing this. It's called Dear Diary Boy, an exacting mother, her free-spirited son, and their bittersweet adventures in an elite Japanese school. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you. The book is a fascinating look into aspects of culture that I am not very familiar with at all. So I'm really excited to talk with you about it and to get a glimpse into this world. But before we do, we always begin with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Okay. As long as I can remember, I always enjoyed reading and getting lost in characters of books. And I found the process of writing to be cathartic because it was sort of like the same thing where I'd imagine myself becoming part of the world of a book. But I never really thought about becoming a writer, so I can't say I have a particular memory of that. I really fell into writing as an adult when I became a journalist.
I've got to make lots of friends that are writers that started as journalists, and that seems to be a great segue into writing for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Was journalism something that you had thought about earlier? You said that you kind of fell into it as an adult. Right. What was your path to journalism?
Yeah, there again, it was sort of serendipity. I vaguely always thought journalism seemed like a fun and glamorous profession, but I never thought I had it in me to become a journalist. But I was living in Tokyo at the time, where I'm from originally, but I've lived overseas quite a bit. And I was visiting a friend in the office of the Associated Press Bureau in Tokyo. And when I happened to visit, they were desperately looking for someone, and they wanted someone who could speak Japanese and write in English. Someone was about to leave the bureau, and they just needed a replacement right away. So when they told me those qualifications and asked me if I was interested, I said, well, yeah, I can do that. I can speak Japanese and write in English, but I don't have any experience in journalism. And they said, that's not a problem because you'll just learn on the job. And I did actually learn on the job very quickly because I got a baptism by fire. There was maybe 2 months after I joined, there was a huge plane crash in Japan, which I think to this day is still the single worst plane crash in terms of victims, in terms of fatalities. There were about more than 500 people died.
Oh my goodness.
I was working the overnight shift with one other person, and we were monitoring the local news wire, which in those days came out in reams of paper. And I didn't even know that when there was a one-line bulletin that came in, and I didn't know at the time that meant it was very likely that it was an accident. So it's a good thing I didn't just throw that piece of paper away. I did go over to the other person who was quite a veteran journalist and said, what do you think about this? And he said, I think you better follow it up right away. So then I just had to scramble and watch the local news, rush to the airport for briefings, and it was quite an experience. I worked round the clock. And then eventually I did get a commendation letter from the president of the AP at the time. And my boss told me, well, you should save that paper because in case they want to fire you in the future, you then take out that piece of paper and say, but you can't fire me because I got this letter.
Right. Oh, man. What really makes great journalists are people that have that eye to tell the story that everyone else is not telling. So you could observe an event like the plane crash that you got your baptism by fire. Was that something that came to you as you were covering this and kind of going through all of the stress and the emotions and all of that comes with that? Were you looking for the story that may be overlooked?
Well, at the AP, and especially in a story like that, when the crash has just happened, it's basically just trying to get all the facts out there as soon as possible. So I don't think I was really looking for a certain angle or trying to write with a particularly discerning eye. I probably shouldn't say that because they might take that letter away. But it was later on when I'd be doing feature stories that I had to think about how to shape a story and what would come across as most convincing. But I think what I really learned from being a journalist is, in my personal view, the best stories are the stories that really tell themselves. So I sort of tried to look at stories that have a certain narrative that I would not have to fancy up the story with flowery words. That the facts are often so compelling that they can tell their own piece. And I think that's why I wrote a memoir. I wrote a nonfiction book because I find that the easiest way to write.
So how long were you in journalism?
I was in journalism. After the AP, I went and worked at Time magazine in Tokyo. So probably a total of about 8 years there. And then this was all quite a while ago. And then after that, I freelanced. Okay.
You said that you were from Japan and Tokyo specifically, I think you said, and but you had lived overseas a good bit. Did you have a pretty traditional Japanese upbringing?
I had a traditional Japanese upbringing in the sense that my parents were very, and this comes across in the book a lot, my parents are quite traditional in their thinking, I believe. However, we did live overseas a lot because my father worked for a trading company and he got transferred. And when I was born in Tokyo, but when I was 1, my family moved to the outskirts of London. And then after 7 years there, we moved back to Tokyo. So I went to about half of my elementary school in Tokyo. And then we moved to the U.S. And I spent my formative years in Washington, D.C. before moving back to Japan to go to university in Japan.
So, at what the book that you've just written, Dear Diary Boy, and this is a memoir, like you mentioned. Will you kind of set up the circumstances that how this particular point in your life you decided to tell this story? What were the circumstances that brought you to this place and this time, and where does this story begin?
Well, I was a single parent in Tokyo with my son, raising my son on my own. And I was planning to send him to the local public school, which I had attended myself, and it's a highly regarded public school. But everybody around me started saying, private education is better now. You should really try to get him into private school. So without really thinking or doing much research, I decided, well, I've got nothing to lose. We'll just apply and see if he passes the test. And then when I started the test, when I got involved in the entrance exam process for young children, the whole process was so bizarre that I thought, wow, that would make a really good story. And at the time, I wasn't in journalism. I wasn't writing anymore. I was working for a private equity fund. But because this seemed like such a compelling story, I decided to write about it. And I wrote a one-page story for the New York Times Magazine. And then there was a lot of interest in that story mostly from people I knew. But it was the first time I had written anything personal from a first-person viewpoint, and I was a little hesitant to do that because as a long-time news journalist, it seemed like I was really putting myself out there. But because a lot of people then gave me their personal feedback, like I felt that way or I agree with this part, I found that very rewarding. And I decided that got me started in writing more columns about things that made an impression on me about life in Tokyo and stuff that I thought say something about Japanese culture. And most of the columns did end up being about my son and his school. So I had those columns, and after he did end up getting into a private school. And then after he graduated, I decided to bring him to the U.S. to educate him in a different environment. And when I moved to New York City to do that, I decided, well, I have all these columns that sort of narrate my son's school life. Maybe I should try to make them into a book. So I sat down and spent about 2 years writing the book.
So what were you went into this school situation with your son, probably not fully prepared for what you would experience. What were some of the shocking circumstances that you found yourself in that maybe made you feel out of your depth a little bit?
Right. Well, I didn't know anything about private elementary schools in Japan because no one in my family had gone to a private elementary school. And actually very few Japanese children do. It's 1% of all elementary school children go to private elementary schools. They're mostly centered in the major cities. I think that 1% is probably increasing now. But so I didn't know how schools were ranked. I found out while I was applying to this school that most parents who send their children to private schools know a bunch of private schools and how they rank. And I also didn't know that there was a very difficult entrance exam that differs according to each school that the children really need to prepare for. I only met one person in the whole process that did not send their child to an exam prep school because it's very difficult if you don't really know how to understand even the questions or what they're asking you. So I only chose one school because I had only really heard of this one school. It happened to be the school that my father had gone to for a short while when he was young. And I was told that, well, you really have to enroll him in an exam prep school. And I found out right away that it was going to be difficult for me to even enroll him in a prep school because when I called around, they said, well, if you're single, the private schools don't like single parents because they don't think they can really handle all the requirements of watching over your child. You probably don't offer him a stable family life. You probably can't afford the tuition. So that was the first hurdle. I finally was able to enroll my son in one school because I had a referral from another mother who already had a child there. And then the amount of things the children have to learn to take the exam, the different kind of topics the exams cover, it differs according to school, but most schools will have a written test and a behavioral test. And the written test has many different components. There's listening comprehension where children will listen to a recording of a story that's quite complicated often. For example, it might be, okay, this child went to the amusement park and rode the Ferris wheel, and then he did this and that and this and that, and later they have questions like, what's the second thing the child did, or what did the child do in the end, and the children aren't expected to be able to read and write, so they sort of circle the picture of the right answer. But there's that listening comprehension, and then there's one where you look at a bunch of patterns, look at a bunch of graphics, and you have to discern what the pattern. There's one blank, and you have to guess which one of the multiple choice answers goes into that blank. There's tests about the different seasons, what kind of flowers bloom in certain seasons, and it was just an enormous amount, most of which I didn't even know the answers to. And then there's the whole behavior test, which often tries to gauge how does a child work with other children. So they might have them go out and play a game, and the teachers would be observing how they relate to the other children. And there were very specific things, like if they're doing an arts and crafts project together, does the child hand a pair of scissors over with the blades facing towards him or herself, as opposed to, dangerously pointing to the other person? Does the child clean up after the craft event is over, or do they just walk away, which would suggest that they don't put away their own toys at home?
So it's very much a test of your parenting, as well as the child at that point. At that point, it would seem like.
Yes, the behavioral part is very much that way.
Wow, what is it like living under that that kind of scrutiny. I think that's, American attitudes tend to be, a lot of times very independent and very, kind of self-assured, that sort of thing. And then when you're in a situation where you are under the microscope, that's got to be a very different feeling.
Oh, it's quite nerve-wracking, and it's especially nerve-wracking because this is usually a child is 5 or 6 when they take the test, so it's unpredictable. And it's usually one day. The test is one day, so if your child decides to be, ornery that one day, that's the end of getting into that school. And then one of the cram school, they're called cram schools, these exam prep schools. The one that my son finally got into, when I got there, I had to sign a paper with all these things saying, well, you'll pay your bills on time and things like that. But one of the items was, if the school deems that the mother is mentally unstable, they have the right to rescind your spot. So,
wow. That is intense.
Yeah.
This is not a solely Japanese phenomenon. We have schools in the U.S. where people are jockeying for position, when children are toddlers, to get into these, elite prep schools and things like that. So this is seems to be a human thing and not necessarily a particular cultural thing. But what sorts of things did you see that were common between the Japanese private school and maybe some of the American schools, and what things were stark contrast to you?
I don't really know about the American schools because I didn't send my child to one. Living in Manhattan, I do hear a lot about the incredible competition.
Right.
But I believe, I may be wrong, I don't think different schools give their own written, unique. So in Japan, it's very difficult because most people apply to several schools. We only apply to one school, but so you have to sort of be trying to guess what each school's test is going to be like, and and prepare for a bunch of different tests. I get the sense that there might be more scrutiny on parents. I think someone in Manhattan told me that the Manhattan schools are really just looking for parents who are not going to be troubling parents to the school. Whereas in Japan, it's probably the same thing actually, but it seemed fairly predictable how they wanted the parents to behave, and they did have parental prep interview sessions, and there's a whole industry on what kind of clothes you should wear. In the case of the woman, it's usually a dark blue suit. And some of them even had, I found this fascinating, some of them came with pockets inside where you could secretly store a little good luck charm. But I don't think the U.S. schools go down to that detail on what you should be wearing.
Tell me about the title of this book. Where does Dear Diary Boy come from?
Among the many demanding requirements that this private school that my son ended up going to was one that the children keep a diary. And they had to write a minimum usually of 3 entries per week. And my son was not an enthusiastic diary writer. So this was another source of the mother-child battles, which is a big theme of my book. And so in order to try to encourage my son to write a diary, my mother, his grandmother, decided to draw a cartoon of a character of a boy who she called Dear Diary Boy. Not Dear Diary Boy, Diary Boy. And Diary Boy is a boy who lives off of diary entries. So she would draw these pictures of a hungry-looking boy sticking words into his mouth. And then she would draw these little pictures on scraps of paper and hide them under his pillow or put them in his school bag so he would discover them or wake up in the morning and see them. And my son actually did write a diary entry about it once, saying, I get these mysterious pictures. And then he wrote, diary boy is a boy that looks like me.
Nice. As working as a journalist, you learn to report on the world, and usually, or sometimes, we'll get a column where the reporter is describing something to us through her eyes and through her experience, but really the story is about something else that's happening, and we're getting to see how she's interacting with the story. When you write memoir, the story is you and your experience, kind of full sail. What was it like for you in writing the book and knowing that this was going to be the most personal thing that you had put out there, and that you were going to have to commit to a level of vulnerability and being exposed, if you will, more so than your journalistic work?
No, I didn't think about it that much because I had already written so many columns that the book is based on.
Yeah.
So I'd already sort of exposed myself. But I do think that the book takes it to a whole nother level. And that was because the columns, I was still sort of doing what you explained earlier. I was talking about myself, but I was also presenting a phenomenon in Japan that I thought would be interesting. Whereas when I wrote the book, it took me about 2 years, but then I showed it to a few people and got a lot of feedback. And the main common feedback that I got from people was, we need to know more about you. And they said my original draft was like a fly on the wall looking at a mother and son going through these battles about school, but they wanted to know more of why I behaved in certain ways, why I was always so mad at my son for not doing his homework. And I had to really do a lot of soul searching. So in one sense, I found I have many friends who've written books, and they're usually completely research-based. So I see them struggling to put together all this research. And in that sense, I felt like, wow, it was really easy for me to write my book because I didn't do any research. I just had to do a lot of navel-gazing. But on the other hand, it was painful for me to have to really recall all these experiences I had, many of them very difficult. And then I had to really do a lot of self-analysis, which I hadn't done before, about myself and why things evolved the way they did.
The book is a very personal look at your relationship with your son, and like you were just talking about there, and a lot of soul searching on the page that we get to be a part of and witness to. The other thing that we're really looking at in this book is, this question of parenting, and are we doing things for the betterment of our child, or are we doing things to fulfill something in us, or is it some other thing altogether? Through this experience with your son and then writing about it, did you come to conclusions that you didn't expect? And did the writing of the book help you to make better sense of the experience that you had with him?
Yes, to all of those questions. As I was writing the book and recalling and trying to think about why I behaved in certain ways, I really did come to realize how much I was focused on a very narrow set of values at the time. I was so obsessed with having my son getting a good grade, being as good as the other children, getting his homework finished, being prepared with all his school items every day, and just really to have my son live up to the standards that the school required. And I felt like my son was just a rebellious, naughty, stubborn child. But as I was writing the book, and especially because I use his diary entries and I had to go through all of his diaries to select the ones I wanted to use, I came to really see that my child was actually a very curious, dreamy, fun-loving child with a good, interesting perspective on things and has a sense of humor. So I really regret that I didn't see more of that and wasn't able to step back and see the bigger picture. So that was a revelation that came from rethinking everything and writing the book.
And sometimes those things are, we can't see them until we're on the other side of it and looking back. Kumiko, what do you hope people take away from this book? If someone is just completely clueless about the situation and maybe about parenting, what do you hope they glean from this book?
I think this book is about Japan. It's about education. It's about parenting. But I think the biggest theme is really how we relate to our struggles. And in this case, the struggle is between myself and my son. And it's a struggle of what to do when you have the best interests of your child in mind, but the child doesn't behave in the way that you think is best. How do you handle that? And I'm hoping that readers they'll think about what they would have done if they were in my situation. Maybe they'll think about how they behave when they struggle. It'd be great if they would reflect on some things like that. And the other thing is, because I felt quite isolated while I was struggling with these things, because all of the other moms and all of the other kids seemed so perfect and getting everything done so easily, which I don't think was actually the case. It was just my paranoid perception of what was going on. I hope that some readers will read this and think, oh, okay, I'm not the only one that has a struggle.
And sometimes it's easier to see our own struggles when we can see that in someone else's struggles. And I think you've done a fantastic job of laying open those things that we all struggle with, and the feelings of inadequacy and all of that stuff. So congratulations on the new book. The book, Dear Diary Boy, is out everywhere now. There's a link to it in the show notes. We highly recommend everyone go grab a copy. Kumiko, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason and Joey took their food trays outside and sat high above the parking lot on the secluded stairwell that had become their lunchtime hangout, picking at their Thanksgiving specials and swapping updates. They were almost finished eating before Jason managed to screw up the courage to say what he needed to. "I want to apologize." Joey looked puzzled. "What the hell for?" "Because your coma was my fault." "Yours? The horseman beamed me, you didn't." "Hey, want to see something cool? Look what I found on my phone." Joey produced the device, hit a few buttons, and swiped his finger. An orange circle hung in a field of black, overexposed, something that had been moving fast when the flash caught it. "I was trying to get his picture, right? Like an idiot? Well, I didn't get him, but that is the pumpkin he threw at me." Jason stared at the blurry orange shape for a long time. "Cool. Cool? Can you imagine if we actually got a picture of the Headless Horseman? We'd be famous by now." He pocketed the phone. "Hey, do you want the rest of this turkey? It looks like bologna." "Tastes like bologna, too." He speared the slice anyway. "Look, this is going to sound weird, but I think I made you a target." "What do you mean?" "I made you a target by telling you about my gift. It's some sort of magical rule. If we reveal ourselves to a normal person, whoever we tell becomes a target for ghosts. And usually, they die." "And you told me anyway?" "No, I'd already told you. There was no way to untell you. Don't be mad. It all worked out, right? Right?" Joey's expression had darkened. "Give me a second here. And there's a bright side." "What bright side?" "Now you'll have a gift too." "Me?" "That's what your coma was. Some kind of transition. You got targeted, but you survived. You'll be a founder now, like Ichabod. You'll pass your gift to your kids like he passed his to me. Joey looked worried. What kind of gift will I get? People get gifts that complement their natural abilities. It could be anything. Anything? So, I could read minds? I guess. Turn purple and levitate? Probably not. Something that expresses the essential you. Then I'll have an actor's gift. What's an actor's gift? Jason shrugged. Super narcissism? Shut up. So you're not mad? Joey was shaking with excitement. Mad? This is the coolest thing ever! We'll be like the dynamic duo, fighting supernatural foes up and down the eastern seaboard. Jason laughed, feeling epic relief. I thought you'd be pissed. Nah. What's a little coma between friends? He took a bite out of a Nutter Butter, grinning madly. I'm going to be a superhero. But you can't tell anyone. Why not? Weren't you listening? Everyone we tell dies. You can't talk about your gift to anybody. But if they were targeted and lived, we could have our own X-Men. Yeah, or all your friends could die. Do you want to risk that? No, I guess not. But I don't do closets very well, you know? I came out at conception. Promise to keep it to yourself. Yeah. Joey shifted sideways and walked his sneakers up the brick. So, the essential me. Ooh, I know what gift I'll get. I'll get a singer's gift. What's a singer's gift? Jason shrugged. Superhuman drug tolerance? Shut up!